She had survived mortar fire in 3 countries, carried wounded men twice her size through smoke and mud, and made life-or-death calls with nothing but field supplies and instinct. But nothing in 8 years of military service had prepared Emily Cross for the moment. A hospital security chief pointed at her chest and said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, "That badge is fake, and so are you." She was 29 years old. It was her first day. And every person in that lobby, nurses, doctors, patients slumped in waiting chairs, went completely still, watching to see what she would do. She did nothing. She stood there and took it. That was the moment Grant Mercer decided she was easy. He was wrong. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happens next will shake you. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The city of Kellport had that particular quality of gray that only coastal industrial towns achieve. Not the clean gray of rain-washed stone, but the tired gray of salt air and old money, of a place that had once been important and still believed it was. Kellport General Hospital sat 3 blocks from the waterfront, a 12-story tower of glass and concrete that locals called the Fortress, without any affection. It had 620 beds, a level 2 trauma center, and a reputation for eating junior staff alive. Emily Cross pulled into the employee parking structure at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes early for her 6 a.m. orientation. She sat in her car for a moment after killing the engine, hands in her lap, eyes on the concrete pillar directly in front of her. The duffel on the passenger seat was the same one she'd carried through Kandahar, through Djibouti, through a forward operating base in northern Syria that didn't officially exist. She'd replaced the zipper once and patched a tear on the bottom panel with duct tape. She never removed because it felt like something she should keep. 8 years in. Honorable discharge. Then 2 years of nursing school on the GI Bill, nights and weekends, studying pharmacology at a kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee going cold beside her. She'd graduated 6 weeks ago. This was her first real job in a hospital with walls and electricity and a bed count she hadn't memorized alongside evacuation routes. She got out of the car, slung the duffel over her shoulder, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby of Kellport General smelled like floor wax and recycled air. 2 nurses in matching burgundy scrubs passed her without acknowledgement. A custodian ran a buffer across the tile in slow, methodical arcs. The information desk at the center of the space was staffed by a young woman whose name tag read Heather, and who was watching a video on her phone with the sound low. A triage desk sat to the left near the ER corridor, and there was already a man in his 40s sitting in one of the plastic waiting chairs, holding a dish towel wrapped around his right hand. Emily stepped up to the security checkpoint near the main entrance. A glass booth flanked by a metal detector, the kind of setup that looked more like theater than actual security. She reached into the front pocket of the duffel and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside was her employee badge, her orientation letter, and a copy of her nursing license with the state seal across the bottom. The officer inside the booth was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, wearing a gray uniform that strained at the collar. His face had the look of someone who'd spent a long time in a position of small authority and had built an entire personality around it. His badge read, Mercer, D., Deputy Chief of Security. He was already watching her when she walked up. "New hire," Emily said, and slid the documents through the slot in the glass. Mercer didn't look at them right away. He looked at her, at the duffel, at her scrubs, which were plain navy with no hospital logo because she'd been told in the orientation packet that branded scrubs were issued on the first day. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women they'd already decided weren't worth the time. "Badge number," he said. She gave it. He typed it in slowly, with 2 fingers, the kind of deliberate slowness that wasn't about accuracy. He looked at the screen. Then he looked back at her. "This doesn't match." "The orientation letter should have the hire code," Emily said. "It's the second page." "I can see what a second page is." He picked up the papers and made a show of examining them. Then he set them down and leaned back in the chair. "You got a photo ID?" She produced her driver's license. He studied it, set it beside the badge, looked back and forth between them. The lobby was filling now. The day shift arriving, people pulling off coats, swiping badges, filing past the checkpoint in the automated lane to the left. A few of them glanced over. Most didn't bother. Says here your hire date is today, Mercer said. But your badge is registering as provisional. That means it hasn't been activated. Okay, Emily said. Is there someone in HR who can confirm? HR doesn't open until 8. My orientation starts at 6. Then you've got a problem. He slid her documents back through the slot. Can't let you through on an unactivated badge. Emily picked up the papers. She kept her expression neutral, which required more effort than she would have admitted. The letter from HR is signed. The badge number matches what's on the letter. I'm standing here 2 hours before the office opens because I was told to be here at 6. Can you call a supervisor? Mercer's face shifted. Something behind the eyes went from indifferent to interested, the way a cat goes still when something small moves in front of it. You telling me how to do my job? He said. No, I'm asking you to make a phone call. He looked past her. There were maybe 15 people in the lobby now. A cluster of night shift nurses waiting for the elevator. A family arriving at the information desk. The man with the dish towel still sitting in his chair, watching with the quiet attention of someone who had nothing else to do. And then Mercer stood up and came out of the booth, which was not something she'd expected him to do. He was a big man, at least 6'2", and he walked with the practiced physicality of someone who'd spent decades using his size to control situations. He came around the booth and stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and said, loudly, clearly, for anyone near enough to hear, I'm going to need you to step aside, miss. I'm looking at a fraudulent employee badge and a name I can't verify in the system. That's a security concern. The word fraudulent hit the air like a slap. The night shift nurses turned. The woman at the information desk looked up from her phone. A physician in a white coat who'd been heading toward the ER slowed his pace and glanced back. That is not a fraudulent badge, Emily said. Her voice was steady, which she was proud of. It was issued by your hospital's HR department, and I have the documentation to prove it. What you have, Mercer said, is a printout anyone could fake. What I have is a system that says this badge isn't activated. And what that tells me is that you either got here through the wrong channel or you got here without authorization. Either way, he reached over and plucked her ID badge from her lanyard, so fast and casual it took her a beat to process what had just happened. You're not getting in today. Give that back. You can submit a formal request to HR when they open at 8. He was already turning back toward the booth. That badge is my property, she said. He stopped and turned. And the look on his face then was something she recognized, something she'd seen before on men who were about to say something they'd wanted to say for a while, looking for the right moment and deciding this was it. No, he said, it's hospital property, just like this building, just like every inch of this lobby. And right now, you don't belong in any of it. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting. Security is going to need you to exit the building, please. You can wait outside until the matter is resolved. Silence. Not complete silence. The floor buffer was still running. Somewhere deeper in the building, a phone was ringing. But the human sounds in that lobby went quiet. The cluster of nurses had stopped pretending not to watch. The physician in the white coat had stopped walking entirely. The man with the dish towel had lowered his hand from his lap. Emily Cross stood there for 3 seconds. She picked up her duffel. She folded her orientation letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the duffel's front pocket. She looked at Mercer. You've made a mistake, she said quietly. Have a nice morning, he said. She walked to the door. She pushed through it. The air outside was cold and salt-sharp, and she stood on the sidewalk outside Kellport General Hospital and thought, with the controlled clarity that had gotten her through worse than this, you have 2 choices. You leave. You get in the car, you drive to a diner, you wait until 8 o'clock, you call HR when they open, and you handle this like a rational adult. Or you stand here. She stood there. At 6:14 in the morning, a Kellport Port Authority officer named Lewis Reardon stopped his patrol vehicle at the intersection of Harbor and 4th and radioed in that he was going to get coffee. At 6:21, he pulled up to the drive-through window of a place called Dockside and said, to no one in particular, that it was going to be a cold one. At 6:22, his radio crackled and then went very loud, very fast. Emily was still standing outside the hospital entrance when she heard the sirens. Not one, not two. A convoy of them, high-pitched, overlapping, coming from the north along Harbor Boulevard, the kind of sound that meant this wasn't a routine call. She'd heard enough sirens in enough countries to know the difference between standard emergency response and something organized and deliberate, something with resources behind it. 3 black SUVs came through the intersection first. Then an ambulance, running hot, lights strobing white and red in the morning gray. Then 2 more SUVs behind it, one with federal plates she clocked at a glance. The convoy turned sharply into the hospital's emergency entrance bay, and the automated doors burst open as someone from the inside had clearly been called ahead. People in uniform she recognized, Navy service dress, came out of the lead SUV before it fully stopped. Emily stepped back against the building's facade and watched. The ambulance reversed into the bay, and the rear doors opened before the EMTs could reach them, and the man they were bringing out was on a stretcher, oxygen mask over his face, leads running from his chest to a portable monitor that was already screaming numbers. He was a large man, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of complexion that comes from years of outdoor discipline and late career stress. And he was the color of old ash. She couldn't see his face. She couldn't see much more than the controlled chaos of the entry, the Navy personnel and the hospital staff and the EMTs all merging into a single organism of urgency. But she saw the board one of the officers was carrying, and on it, in the shorthand of transit transfer, she could read the patient's initial assessment. Acute MY, suspected, unresponsive for 11 minutes, BP crashing, no response to initial nitro. 11 minutes unresponsive. That was a very bad number. She didn't think. She moved. The ER admitting desk was 40 feet inside the main entrance, and Emily pushed through the doors with her badge in one hand and the orientation envelope in the other and said to the charge nurse behind the counter, "I'm Emily Cross, incoming nursing staff. The patient they just brought in. I saw the field report. What's his status?" The charge nurse, a compact woman with close-cropped hair and the permanent expression of someone who managed catastrophe for a living, looked at her for half a second. "And you are?" "New hire. Start date today. I know that's a problem, but not right now." Emily put her hands on the counter. The assessment said 11 minutes unresponsive, suspected MI, no response to nitro. That pattern is specific. Are they checking for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with outflow obstruction? Because if they're treating it as a standard STEMI and they haven't ruled out obstruction, the nitro could be making it worse. The charge nurse looked at her for a beat longer than was comfortable. "What did you say your name was?" "Cross, Emily Cross." From down the hall behind her, a voice, large, authoritative, the voice of a man who had learned to project because rooms demanded it, cut across the ambient noise of the ER. "Get her out of here." Grant Mercer had come in through the secondary corridor. He was red in the face and walking with the particular energy of a man who'd been embarrassed and wanted the world to know someone else was responsible for it. He pointed at Emily from 15 feet away. "That woman was removed from the building. She does not have authorized access." "She has an issue with badge activation," the charge nurse said. "She has an issue with security, is what she has," Mercer said. He looked at Emily. "I don't know how you got back in, but you're leaving again." "There's a patient in that trauma bay who may be getting the wrong treatment," Emily said, and she kept her voice level, which was getting harder. "I'm trying to give the team information that might matter. You're a nursing student in borrowed scrubs who snuck back into a hospital she was removed from. That's all you are." He was beside her now, shoulder turned to create a physical barrier. "And if you don't walk out on your own, I'm calling city police." "Call them," she said. "Emily?" The voice came from down the hall, low, rough, thickened by the oxygen mask that had apparently just been removed, but clear and certain. The kind of voice that doesn't ask. It identifies, it confirms, it proceeds. She turned. At the end of the corridor, the trauma bay doors were half open. The stretcher was visible, the lead still attached, the portable monitor still screaming, and the man on the stretcher had turned his head toward her. His face was the color of ash, and his eyes were sharp and exhausted, and fixed directly on her with the recognition of someone who had been looking at a lot of faces for a long time and remembered the ones that mattered. Vice Admiral Thomas Hale, commander of the 3rd Naval Response Group, had the eyes of a man who made decisions that cost lives or saved them, sometimes both in the same afternoon. He had last seen Emily Cross in a field hospital outside a mountain town whose name she still couldn't say in public. He looked nothing like the man she remembered from that night. Smaller, somehow, older, the uniform traded for a hospital gown and the authority stripped to its essential core, but the recognition was mutual and instantaneous. "Cross," he said. Her mouth went dry. "Get over here." Batuk. She crossed the hallway. She was aware of Mercer's hand closing around her arm from behind, and she stopped walking. Not because of the grip, but because she turned and looked at him, and something in her expression made him loosen his fingers without fully letting go. "You are not authorized to be in that trauma bay," he said. His voice had dropped. The audience was gone. The charge nurse had moved around the desk, 2 ER physicians were visible in the doorway of the bay, and the Navy officers from the convoy were watching from the end of the corridor. "I don't care who that patient is. You do not have credentials to treat—" "I'm not treating him," Emily said. "I'm going to talk to the team." She looked at his hand on her arm. "You should let go." He let go. She pushed through the trauma bay doors. The room was dense with people and machinery. 2 physicians in white coats, one young, one past retirement age, both moving with the compressed haste of a situation that was not going as planned, were working around the Admiral, who had been reconnected to the overhead monitor, the numbers across the top of the display red and insistent. A respiratory tech stood at the ventilator that was not yet being used but had been moved into ready position. A pharmacist was at the supply station pulling drawers with sharp efficiency. Emily looked at the monitor. She looked at the rhythm strip. She looked at the field report clipped to the top of the intake board, which someone had set on the counter in the transit from the stretcher. "You've given him 3 rounds of nitroglycerin," she said. The younger physician, Dr. Something, she hadn't caught his name, 30s, the kind of exhaustion in his face that meant he'd been on since yesterday, turned. "Who are you?" "Emily Cross. It doesn't matter. You've given him nitro, and his pressure is still dropping. Is there a family history of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy on that intake sheet?" "The intake sheet is incomplete. This was a field response." "Then I'm asking what the echo shows." "We haven't—" He stopped. The older physician had turned too now, the way people turn when someone says something that snags on something else they've been thinking. "We haven't run the echo yet." If this is hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, HOCM, the nitro is actively worsening his condition. It drops preload. In obstruction, that's the opposite of what you need. She moved to the intake board without asking permission and scanned the field notes. Onset during physical exertion, sudden collapse? Physical briefing, yes. Sudden collapse, yes. That's the presentation. That plus age, plus non-response to nitro, plus this rhythm. She pointed at the monitor without touching it. You need to be thinking about beta blocker, phenylephrine, to increase afterload, get him flat, and get that echo running immediately. He needs fluids, not vasodilators. The room went quiet. Not the good quiet, the bad quiet. The quiet of a room full of trained people who are staring at a suggestion they hadn't made and feeling the discomfort of wondering if they should have. The older physician crossed the room in 4 steps and looked at the monitor, then at the rhythm strip, then at Emily. "Who trained you?" he said. "Combat medicine. Forward operating bases, hostile terrain, limited resources." She met his eyes. "I've seen this twice before." "You've seen HOCM in the field." "I've seen the presentation, twice. One of them we got wrong the first time." She kept her voice flat. "We don't have time for me to be wrong the second time here." Outside the trauma bay, she could hear Mercer's voice. He'd found someone, a hospital administrator, from the sound of the exchanges, fast and official. She heard the words unauthorized access, security threat, removed from the premises, and under other circumstances she might have let it land differently. But right now the monitor above Admiral Hale's chest was still screaming the same terrible numbers it had been when she walked in. The young physician looked at the older one. The older physician looked at Admiral Hale. Hale's eyes were open, unfocused but tracking, the oxygen mask back over his face. He was looking at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a man who had made peace with uncertainty. Not with dying, not with this, but with the specific uncertainty of not knowing which decision the people above him were going to make. The older physician said, to no one specifically, "Get the echo in here." "You're listening to her?" The young physician's voice had an edge. "She's not on staff. We don't even know her credentials." "Then let's be wrong," the older one said, and he was already moving, his voice low and even. "Let's run the echo and be wrong about the obstruction. And if I'm wrong, I'll file my own incident report. But if she's right, and we keep pushing nitro—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The echo machine was wheeled in. Emily stepped back and stood against the wall and watched. She had given what she had. The rest was theirs. 3 minutes later, the echocardiogram image assembled on the portable screen, and the older physician put both hands on the edge of the cart and looked at it for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that was very quiet and very careful, "Stop the nitro." The transition from wrong to right in medicine has its own particular sound. It is not dramatic. It is the sound of an order given that contradicts the previous order, of equipment repositioned without explanation, of the vocabulary in the room shifting almost imperceptibly from diagnosis to correction. Emily had heard that sound in a tent in Syria with no electricity and in a FOB mess hall converted to a triage space, and once in a helicopter over water where the noise of the rotors made it nearly impossible to hear anything at all. She heard it now, in the trauma bay of Kellport General, and she let out a breath she'd been holding since the lobby. The beta blocker was drawn, phenylephrine was pushed, the head of the bed came flat. Admiral Hale's pressure, which had been in the 70s and falling, stopped falling. Held. Then, at 7 minutes after the protocol change, began to climb. Nobody said anything about that either. Emily was looking at the monitor when she became aware that Grant Mercer had entered the trauma bay. He was with a man she didn't know. 50s, hospital administration badge, the kind of expression that tries to communicate authority and mostly communicates discomfort. 3 of the Navy officers from the convoy were behind them in the doorway. "This is her," Mercer said. "The woman I told you about." The administrator, his badge read Caldwell, Hospital Operations, looked at Emily with the calculating expression of someone assessing how much of a problem she was. "Are you Emily Cross?" "Yes." "You were removed from the building by Chief Mercer earlier this morning." "I was." "On what authority did you re-enter?" She didn't answer right away because across the room the older physician, whose name she still hadn't caught, had turned from the echo screen and was looking at Caldwell with the particular expression of a physician who is about to say something to an administrator that the administrator is not going to enjoy. "On my authority," the physician said, "Dr. Marcus Vane, senior attending, Kellport General, 18 years. He pulled his glasses down and looked at Caldwell over the top of them. "She gave us information that changed this patient's treatment protocol. The patient's condition has stabilized." Caldwell blinked. "She is not a licensed member of staff. She has a nursing license. She told us that herself. And she told us something our entire team missed." Vane gestured toward the monitor without looking at it. "So if you'd like to have that conversation right now, in this room, in front of these gentlemen," he nodded toward the Navy officers in the doorway, "then let's have it." Caldwell looked at the Navy officers. The officers looked at Caldwell. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s, commander insignia on her collar, the exact expression of someone who has been trained to absorb all available information before drawing conclusions, stepped forward. "I'm Commander Renata Solis, Naval Support Group 3. The patient is Vice Admiral Thomas Hale. We'd appreciate it if any decisions about personnel in this room were held until the Admiral is stable and can speak for himself." She looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the floor, and then Admiral Hale, who had been watching the exchange from beneath the oxygen mask with the focused attention of a man who had run enough strategy sessions to recognize a power vacuum, when he saw one, reached up and moved the mask aside. His voice came out rough and low but completely clear. "Nobody," he said, "is removing that nurse." The room stilled. "Are we understood?" Tassan. Silence held for a long moment. Then Caldwell said carefully, "Of course, Admiral. and moved aside. Mercer didn't move at all. He stood in the doorway of the trauma bay with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that Emily recognized because she'd seen it before, not in a hospital, but in every organization that runs on authority and fear. She'd seen the face of a man realizing, for the first time, that neither of those things was going to work. She didn't look at him for long. She turned back to the monitor. Admiral Hale's pressure was at 104/68 and still climbing. The rhythm on the strip had lost the ugly irregularity from the intake board and was moving with the stubborn steadiness of a heart that had been given the right information and had decided to stay in the fight. Dr. Vane moved to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the numbers. Then he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "2 of my residents were in this room for 20 minutes before you walked in. How long were you in here?" She looked at him. 6 minutes, she said. He nodded. Once, and looked back at the monitor. Outside in the corridor, she could no longer fully see through the bay's half-open door. She heard the sound of Commander Solis speaking into a radio. She caught fragments, stabilized, breach of protocol, full incident report, name cross, E. She heard the shift in tone that meant someone on the other end of that radio was receiving information and deciding what to do with it. She didn't know what Mercer had on her. She didn't know what paperwork existed, or what claims he'd already made, or what version of this morning he'd already put into a report. She knew that being right in a trauma bay didn't automatically protect you from being wrong on paper, and she knew that people like Mercer understood that distinction very well. But right now, in this room, Admiral Hale was breathing. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that had ever mattered. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the clock on the wall above it. She looked at the rhythm strip still scrolling across the bottom of the display, the peaks and valleys of a heartbeat steadied by the right intervention at the right moment. And she thought, not for the first time, not for the 100th time, that every single thing in her life had been leading to exactly this kind of moment, standing in a room where something almost went wrong and knowing in the specific and unglamorous way of someone who had been trained to know exactly how to pull it back. From somewhere in the building above them, a door opened. Footsteps on a stairwell, more than one set, moving fast. Caldwell's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that told a story, but enough. He stepped back into the corridor and answered it, and what Emily heard before the door swung shut was 2 words in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Yes, sir." She watched the monitor. The heartbeat held. The footsteps on the stairwell got louder, and then the corridor door opened, and 2 men in suits walked in with the particular purposeful quiet of people who had been briefed on the way over. Emily didn't recognize them, but Commander Solis did. She straightened almost imperceptibly, a reflex of acknowledgement rather than deference, the way military personnel respond to rank that has been transferred into civilian clothes and still carries its weight. She nodded to the taller of the 2 men and said something low that Emily couldn't hear, and the man nodded back and looked through the trauma bay window with the measuring attention of someone taking inventory. Caldwell came back in through the bay door with his phone still in his hand, and his face wearing an expression Emily hadn't seen on him before. Careful, recalibrated, stripped of the administrative confidence he'd walked in with. He stood near the door and didn't say anything. Mercer was gone. She hadn't seen him leave. She'd been watching the monitor and then the corridor, and somewhere in between those 2 moments, he had simply stopped being in the room. The space where he'd been standing was empty, and nobody had remarked on it, which told her something about what Mercer was to this place, present when he had power, absent when he didn't. Dr. Vane ordered a second echo for 30 minutes out and asked for a cardiology consult, which meant the immediate crisis had resolved enough that protocol could reassert itself. The respiratory tech wheeled the ventilator back to its ready position along the wall. The pharmacist logged the medication changes with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that documentation was its own form of medicine. Emily stayed against the wall until Vane turned to her and said, "You should sit down." "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. I said you should sit down." He gestured toward the rolling stool beside the supply station. "You've been standing since you walked in, and you look like you've been awake since last Tuesday." She sat down. It was a good suggestion. Her legs, she realized, had been carrying attention she hadn't consciously registered. The locked muscle readiness of someone who expected at any moment to be physically removed from the room. How did you know? Vane said. Not aggressively. Genuinely, the way a physician asks a question when the answer is going to change something. I told you, 2 prior cases. In the field, one in Kandahar, one in Djibouti. She looked at her hands, which were still. In Kandahar, we had a 22-year-old who collapsed during a training run. Initial assessment was exertional heat stroke. We treated for it. He deteriorated. We didn't catch the HOCM until we were already losing him. We kept him alive, but it was close. She paused. After that, I read everything I could find about the presentation. I still have the notes I made. They're in a notebook somewhere in a storage unit in Virginia. Vane looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Where did you do your nursing training? Coastal Community College, GI Bill program. That's not where you learned about HOCM. No, she agreed. That's not where I learned about it. He nodded and didn't ask anything else, which she appreciated more than she could say. They moved the Admiral out of the trauma bay and into a monitored room in the cardiac unit on the 4th floor at 8:47 a.m. By then, the hospital had gone through a particular kind of transformation that institutions undergo when someone important is inside them. Not panic, not exactly, but a heightened attentiveness, a collective awareness that the usual margins for error had narrowed. Kellport General's CEO had arrived. The cardiology department head had been called in from home. 3 additional Navy officers had joined the 2 men in suits in a conference room on the 2nd floor, and Commander Solis was running between floors with the controlled urgency of someone managing multiple simultaneous fires. Emily had been largely forgotten in the shuffle, which was fine with her. She sat in a chair at the end of the 4th floor corridor and drank a cup of coffee that a night shift nurse named Patty had pressed into her hands without explanation or expectation. And she called the HR direct line that was listed in the orientation packet and got a voicemail, and left a message that was precise and unemotional and mentioned nothing about what had happened in the lobby. She thought about calling her sister. She didn't. She thought about the storage unit in Virginia and the notebook with her field medicine notes, and a photograph she'd taken of the Kandahar FOB's exterior on a disposable camera before she'd known cameras were technically prohibited in that zone. She thought about all the ways a person accumulates knowledge, the way the body learns things that the mind hasn't fully processed yet, the way muscle memory survives intact through transitions that wreck everything else. She was still thinking about this when Commander Solis sat down in the chair beside her. Emily looked at her. Solis looked back with the frank, assessing quality of someone who had been running assessments all morning and was not yet done. "How are you holding up?" Solis said. "I'm fine." That's what people say when they're not fine and they don't want to discuss it. Or when they actually are fine and they don't want to make a thing of it. Solis studied her for a beat. "The Admiral wants to see you." Emily set down the coffee. "I figured." "Not yet. He's with the cardiologist right now. Probably another 40 minutes. Solis crossed one leg over the other and looked down the corridor, and her profile had the same quality as her full face. Measured, unsentimental, watchful. "I want to ask you something first." "Okay." "The intake, this morning. What Mercer did." Emily didn't say anything. "I need to understand what happened. Not because of you. You were clearly in the right, and that's documented now. But because the Admiral is going to ask me, and when the Admiral asks me something, I'm responsible for the accuracy of the answer." Solis turned back to look at her. "Walk me through it." So she did. She told it the way she'd been trained to report. Chronological, factual, no editorializing. The parking structure, the lobby, the badge, the documentation she'd had, the slow, deliberate way Mercer had typed her number with 2 fingers, the way he'd stepped out of the booth. She described the moment he took the badge from her lanyard without inflection because inflection wasn't the point. She told Solis what he'd said, quoted it as accurately as she could remember, and noted who had been present. Solis listened without interrupting. When Emily finished, she said, "You quoted him as using the word fraudulent." "Yes." "Out loud, in the lobby, when there were other people present." "At least 50, maybe more." "And when you came back in, he grabbed your arm." "He put his hand on my arm." "I wouldn't characterize it as grabbing." She considered. It was controlling, the intention was controlling, but I didn't feel physically endangered. You said you looked at him, and he let go. Yes. Solis looked at her for a moment. What did you do in the service? Combat medicine, attached to a forward response unit. Which unit? Emily held her gaze. The classification on that is still active. Something shifted in Solis's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the same adjustment and assessment that Dr. Vane had made when Emily told him about the field cases. As if a variable they hadn't accounted for had just been entered into the equation. Okay, Solis said. She uncrossed her legs and stood up. 40 minutes. I'll come back. She walked down the corridor and Emily watched her go and then picked up her coffee, which had gone cold. 43 minutes later, she was standing inside a hospital room that had been modified in the intervening time to accommodate the specific needs of a recovering flag officer. Extra chairs had appeared, the monitors had been upgraded to a more comprehensive display, and one of the men in suits was standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of someone who was there officially and trying not to be conspicuous about it. Vice Admiral Thomas Hale was sitting up in the bed. He still had the color of a man who'd had a very bad morning, but his eyes were alert and his hands were folded in his lap with a deliberate stillness that Emily recognized as the trained composure of a person who understood they were being observed and chose how to present themselves accordingly. Close the door, he said to the room in general. Solis pulled it shut from the inside. Hale looked at Emily. She looked back. You got taller, he said. She almost laughed. I don't think that's possible, sir. Sit down, Cross. She sat in the chair closest to the bed. Hale watched her settle and then looked past her at Solis. Give us 5 minutes. Solis and the man in the suit exited without comment. When the door closed, Hale's composure didn't change exactly, but something in his face went slightly less formal, the way people's faces do when they stop performing for the room and let the actual expression through. I heard about what happened in the lobby, he said. It's been resolved, sir. Has it? My credentials are being confirmed by HR. Administratively, it should be straightforward. I'm not talking about your credentials. His voice was quiet, and the quietness of it had weight behind it, the particular weight of a man who'd spent 34 years making decisions that other people had to live with. I'm talking about a senior security official publicly accusing a decorated service member of fraud, in front of witnesses, and then putting his hands on her when she objected. She looked at him. You've been briefed. Solis is thorough. He shifted slightly against the pillow, and the movement cost him something, a small tightening around the eyes that he didn't comment on. Tell me what you remember. From Coast. Coast. She hadn't said the name aloud in almost 3 years. Sir, I don't know how much of that record is. Tell me what you remember. She looked at the window. Outside, the gray of the morning had shifted toward something slightly lighter, not quite clouds breaking, but the suggestion of the possibility of it. She looked at the monitor above his bed. She looked at her hands. It was a night extraction, she said. The team had taken fire at the secondary checkpoint. 3 casualties, 2 critical. One of the criticals was a tension pneumothorax with a complicating factor. The trocar kit had been in the vehicle that took the hit, and the kit was compromised. We had to improvise. She paused. I used a 14-gauge catheter and a piece of tubing from the field IV kit. The seal wasn't perfect. I had to maintain it manually for about 40 minutes until we reached the transport. Hale looked at her steadily. The other critical was yours, she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once, barely. Hemorrhagic shock. Blood pressure was gone before we hit the ground. You gave me 4 units of ONEG from the portable cooler, pushed fluids, packed the wound with what you had. Keto gauze and direct pressure. The gauze was from my personal kit. The one in the vehicle had been contaminated. You carried your own. I always carried my own. She looked at him. You were critical for about 2 hours. You stabilized before transport arrived. I stabilized, he said, because you kept me in the game. He said it flatly, like a fact he had cataloged and carried for 5 years and didn't need to examine further. And this morning, you kept me in the game again. The attending caught it, she said. I pointed him at it. Don't do that. She didn't say anything. I know how that works, he said, not unkindly. I've watched people do exactly what you just did for 34 years. Somebody makes the call that saves the operation, and then they step back and let someone with more rank take the credit because it's easier that way, because pushing back costs something. He looked at her directly. I'm asking you not to do it right now, in this room, with me. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Good. He shifted again, and this time she saw how much the effort was costing him. The controlled breathing, the careful management of a body that had been through significant trauma in the past several hours. I want to know what happened in that lobby in detail. Solis gave me the outline. I want your words. She told him, the same version she'd given Solis, accurate, specific, uneditorialized. He listened the same way Solis had, without interrupting, with the particular quality of attention that senior officers develop because their job is to extract accurate information from chaotic situations, and they have learned that the fastest way to contaminate the information is to interrupt the flow of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The badge he took from your lanyard, he said. Where is it now? I don't know, he kept it. Hale's jaw moved in a small, contained way. Solis. The door opened. Solis had been in the corridor, which meant she'd been close enough to hear the call. Get me the security footage from the main lobby entrance 0600 to 0630, Hale said. And I want to know where Mercer is right now. Solis said, He's on administrative grounds. He returned to the security office after the incident in the trauma bay. Is he still in the building? As of 10 minutes ago, yes. Hale nodded once. Then he stays in the building. He looked at Solis with the expression of a man issuing an order he expected to be followed. Nobody tells him to leave. Nobody tells him anything. Solis nodded and withdrew. Hale turned back to Emily. His face was tired now, the sustained effort of the conversation showing at the edges. The pale quality around his mouth, the slight heaviness of the eyelids. But his eyes were still sharp. You're starting a new job today, he said. That was the plan. The plan is still the plan. Whatever administrative issues Mercer created this morning will be resolved today. I'll see to that personally. He looked at her steadily. What I need you to understand is that what happened in this lobby today, what he did, what he said, in front of witnesses, to a veteran who came here with proper credentials and proper documentation to begin a legitimate job, that is not something I'm going to let disappear into a report. She looked at him carefully. Sir, I appreciate that. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not asking. He almost smiled, and the almost smile was tired and dry and genuine in a way that the full version probably wouldn't have been. That's exactly why I'm saying it. Ted. She left the room 20 minutes later and stood in the corridor and let out a long breath that she hadn't been aware she was holding. Her phone buzzed. It was HR, not a callback from her voicemail, but a direct call from a number she didn't recognize. A woman named Diane Yost, who introduced herself as the HR director and spoke with the particular clipped efficiency of someone who had been briefed in the past hour and was managing the conversation accordingly. Ms. Cross, I want to apologize for the disruption to your intake this morning, Yost said. Thank you. Your badge has been activated. You'll receive a replacement physical badge at orientation this afternoon. We're moving your orientation to 2 o'clock given the circumstances. In the interim, I've authorized a temporary access credential that the nursing supervisor on 4 can provide. A pause. I also want to let you know that I've personally pulled your file and your credentials are exactly as submitted. Your nursing license, your transcripts, your employment verification, everything is in order. I know, Emily said. A beat. Yes, Yost said carefully. Of course. Is there anything else I need to do on my end? No, we'll see you at 2. Another pause, and then, with the slightly strained quality of someone saying something they've been instructed to say, again, I apologize for how your morning began. Emily thanked her and hung up. She stood for a moment in the corridor, watching the regular movement of the floor. Nurses at the station, an orderly pushing a medication cart, a family clustered outside a room 3 doors down. The ordinary machinery of a hospital in motion, the relentless continuity of care that doesn't stop for politics or embarrassment or the small dramas that security chiefs perform in lobbies. She thought about what Hale had said, about the footage. She hadn't been thinking about the cameras when Mercer was standing in front of her that morning. She'd been focused on her breathing, on keeping her face neutral, on not giving him the reaction he wanted. But the lobby of Kellport General had cameras at the entrance checkpoint, at the information desk, and along both corridors. She'd clocked them automatically, the way she clocked exits and obstructions, without assigning them significance in the moment. Now she assigned them significance. She walked back down to the second floor, where the cardiology consult had set up a temporary workspace in a conference room adjacent to the cardiac unit. Dr. Vane was sitting at the long table with the cardiologist, a trim woman in her early 50s named Ortega, reviewing the echo images on a laptop. They looked up when Emily appeared in the doorway. "I wanted to check in," Emily said. "Is there anything you need from me for the incident documentation?" Vane looked at Ortega, and something passed between them in the shorthand of people who had been talking before she arrived. "Actually," Vane said, "yes." "Can you sit down for a minute?" She sat. Ortega turned the laptop so Emily could see the screen. It was displaying the echo from that morning, frozen on a specific frame. "I want to show you something," Ortega said, and her voice had the careful quality of a clinician presenting information to a colleague, not to a patient or a subordinate. "This is the left ventricular outflow tract. This thickness here, that's the septal hypertrophy. In a standard STEMI workup, it's easy to miss if you're not specifically looking for asymmetry in the wall motion." Emily looked at the image. "You knew to look for it," Ortega said. "Without echo, without the imaging, just from the presentation and the medication response. How confident were you?" 70%, Emily said honestly. "Maybe 75. "You presented it as though you were certain. In the field, 75% is how certain you get. You don't have time to caveat the recommendation. You make the call and you absorb the consequences." She met Ortega's eyes. "I was prepared to be wrong." Ortega looked at her for a long moment. "I've been in cardiology for 22 years, she said. "I have residents who have been on this rotation for 6 months, who I have specifically taught to screen for HOCM in high-risk presentations. 2 of them were in that trauma bay." She paused. "I'm not criticizing them. The presentation was ambiguous and they were moving fast. But I want you to understand that what you did this morning was not something that happens by accident." Emily didn't respond to that. There was no good response to it that didn't either minimize what had happened or overclaim it. "Is there anything you need from me for the documentation?" she said again. Vane pulled a pad toward him. "Yes. Start from when you saw the intake board." She gave her account for the second time that morning, this time in the language of clinical narrative. Specific, technical, time-stamped as best she could reconstruct. Vane wrote most of it, and Ortega added notes on the echo findings and the medication chronology. When they were done, Ortega asked her 3 follow-up questions about the Kandahar case with the focused interest of someone building a differential. "I'd like to write this up," Ortega said. "The field case, and this one, as a case study. The recognition pattern, the transfer of tactical diagnostic knowledge to a civilian setting." She looked at Emily carefully. "With your permission and with all identifiers removed from the military record." Emily considered that. She thought about the notebook in the storage unit in Virginia, the one she'd made after Kandahar, and she thought about the 22-year-old from that training run and whether the careful written account of his case might, at some remove and with all names stripped away, be worth something to a cardiologist writing up a study in a hospital in Kellport. "Yes," she said, "you can use it." She left them and went back to the nursing station on 4 to collect the temporary access credential from the nursing supervisor, a tall, angular man named Doherty, who handed her the lanyard with the compressed efficiency of a person who had already processed the morning's events and filed them in the category of things I will understand later. "You're the one from the lobby," he said. "Yes?" "You're going to have a story to tell at orientation." He almost smiled, and it softened his face considerably. 2 o'clock, second floor, room 2C. Yost is running it. He paused. "How are you doing?" The question surprised her because it was direct and apparently genuine, and she hadn't been expecting it. "Working on it," she said. He nodded like that was an acceptable answer and went back to his station. She clipped the temporary credential to her lanyard and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby level because there was something she wanted to do before 2 o'clock, and the elevator was the fastest way to get there. The lobby, when she stepped out of the elevator, had returned to its ordinary rhythm. The morning rush had passed, and the mid-morning pace had settled in. A mix of outpatient visitors, a delivery courier at the desk, a pair of nurses from another floor crossing toward the cafeteria entrance. The security checkpoint near the main entrance was staffed by a different officer now, younger, who glanced at Emily's temporary credential and nodded without comment. She stood in the lobby for a moment. She looked at the camera above the security booth, the one that would have been facing out toward the checkpoint, angled to capture the full width of the intake lane and the space immediately in front of it. She thought about what was on that footage. She thought about the word fraudulent, said loudly, in a public space, in front of 15 or more witnesses. She thought about the badge lifted from her lanyard with the casual precision of a man who had done it before. Not the badge specifically, but the gesture, the taking of something, the small controlled act of removing a person's claim to belonging. She had seen people like Mercer before. Not all of them wore security uniforms. Some of them wore rank insignia, and some of them wore the title of director, and some of them wore nothing more than the confidence of a person who had never once been held accountable in a room full of people who should have said something and didn't. She had survived all of them. Not because she was particularly strong or particularly lucky, but because she had learned, over 8 years and across multiple continents, a single practical truth. The only thing that actually stops people like that is documentation. And the camera above the security booth had been running at 6 in the morning. She was still looking at it when she became aware of a new kind of quiet behind her. Not the ordinary quiet of an emptying lobby, but the specific quality of people pausing, attention redirected, the herd instinct of a public space responding to something that doesn't fit the pattern. She turned around. Grant Mercer was crossing the lobby from the corridor that led to the security offices, and he was not alone. There was a man beside him she didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, no visible credentials, the careful, unhurried bearing of a person who didn't need to look like anything because he already was something. They were walking toward the exit, not toward the elevator. Not upward, out. Mercer's face, when he passed close enough for her to see it clearly, had the contained blankness of a man managing something with concentrated effort. He didn't look at the ceiling. He didn't look at the camera above the security booth. He looked straight ahead with the deliberate neutrality of a person who understood, on some cellular level, that the act of not looking at something was its own form of acknowledgement. He was halfway to the door when Commander Solis stepped out of the stairwell. She had 2 of the Navy officers behind her, and she was carrying a tablet in one hand with the screen facing down. And she walked directly to Mercer and stopped in front of him with the unhurried calm of someone who had already run every version of this conversation and knew how it ended. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "can I ask where you're going?" "Off shift," he said. "My hours ended at 7. "I understand. I just need 10 minutes of your time before you leave." She looked at the man beside him briefly without particular emotion. "Your colleague is welcome to wait." Mercer looked at Solis. He looked at the 2 officers behind her. He looked at the tablet in her hand. "What is this about?" he said. Solis turned the tablet over and held it facing him. Emily was 20 feet away and couldn't see the screen clearly, but she saw Mercer's face when he looked at it. She had watched men receive information that changed everything for them. In field situations, in debrief rooms, in the particular moment during a medical emergency when the numbers on the monitor said something that the treatment plan hadn't accounted for. She knew what that moment looked like from the outside. It looked like this. The color went out of his face in a way that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the specific terror of a man who has just realized that what he thought was private has been visible the entire time. Solis said, "The Admiral would like to speak with you." Emily turned back to the security camera. Behind her, she heard Mercer say something, too low, too strangled to be coherent, and then the sound of feet on tile. Solis and the officers redirecting, the heavy door of the administrative corridor opening and closing. The lobby returned to its ordinary sounds. The delivery courier at the desk was still signing something. The cafeteria-bound nurses had already gone. The young officer at the checkpoint was checking his phone. Emily stood in the middle of the lobby where, 4 hours earlier, a man with a gray uniform and two fingers on a keyboard had looked at her documentation, looked at her face, and decided she didn't belong. She stood in the same spot where he had said the word fraudulent to an audience of 15 people who had gone quiet and watched. She thought about the notebook in Virginia. She thought about a 22-year-old in Kandahar who had gone into cardiac arrest during a training run and been brought back by a field medic who had read everything she could find about HOCM by flashlight in a tent because she never wanted to be wrong the same way twice. She thought about the camera above the security booth, still running, still recording, the ordinary, indifferent eye of an institution going about its business. Something was going to come out of that footage. She didn't know yet how bad it would be for Mercer, how far back the investigation would reach, what it would find. She knew how these things tended to go. Not smoothly, not quickly, with reversals and delays, and the institutional resistance that protects people who've been in a place long enough to know where the soft spots are. But she also knew something else. She knew that Solis had been standing in the stairwell. That meant Solis had come down to be in that lobby before Mercer walked through it, which meant Solis had known Mercer was going to walk through it, which meant someone had been watching where Mercer was the whole time, which meant the Admiral's instruction, nobody tells him to leave, nobody tells him anything, had been a specific tactical decision to keep Mercer in the building until the moment of Solis's choosing. This was not going to be a complaint filed with HR. This was going to be something else. She was still standing in the lobby when her phone buzzed again. An unknown number, different from the HR director's, with a 703 area code. She looked at it for a moment, Northern Virginia. The area code that covered, among other things, a substantial portion of the federal government's administrative infrastructure. She answered. A man's voice said, "Is this Emily Cross?" "Yes." "Hold for Admiral Hale, please." She held. There was a pause, and then a sound of transfer, and then Hale's voice, rougher than it had been in the room, the fatigue more audible now that he was not performing composure for an audience, said, "Cross, I need you to come back to 4. "I'm coming," she said. "There's someone here who wants to meet you." She was already moving toward the elevator when he said, "It's going to change some things." The doors opened. She stepped in. The lobby disappeared behind her. The elevator opened on 4 and she walked out into a floor that had changed. Not physically. Same corridor, same nursing station, same pale institutional light, but the quality of activity on it had shifted in the 40 minutes she'd been gone. There were more people moving with more purpose. An additional Navy officer stood at the end of the hall near Hale's room. The man in the suit who had been positioned by the window earlier was now in the corridor outside the room, speaking quietly into a phone. He looked up when Emily came off the elevator and watched her walk the length of the corridor with the measuring attention of someone who had been told to expect her. He opened the door before she reached it. Hale was sitting up straighter than when she'd left, which told her something about who was in the room, the unconscious physical adjustment of a senior officer in the presence of another. The cardiologist, Ortega, was at the monitor near the window, not examining it, just present, which meant she'd been asked to stay. Commander Solis was in the far corner, tablet in hand, the contained posture of someone running operations from a position of deliberate stillness. The third person was seated in the chair beside the bed. She was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray blouse, no insignia, but she held herself with the economy of movement that doesn't belong to civilians. Late 50s, close-cropped silver hair, the kind of face that had been weathered not by sun, but by years of rooms where everything said mattered. She looked at Emily with clear, direct eyes and did not fill the silence with anything preliminary. Hale said, "Emily Cross. This is Rear Admiral Constance Farrow. She's currently serving as Deputy Director, Defense Health Integration. She flew up from Washington this morning." Farrow said, "Sit down, please." Emily sat. "I've read your file," Farrow said. "I've read the redacted version, which is what I'm authorized to discuss in this setting, and I've read the summary that Admiral Hale's office provided this morning." She had a deliberate cadence, not slow exactly, but the pace of someone who had learned to match the speed of her words to the weight of them. "I understand you diagnosed a HOCM presentation under pressure without imaging and without the patient's history." I flagged the possibility. The attending confirmed it. I also understand you were publicly accused of fraud by a hospital security official prior to that, denied access to the building, and physically impeded when you attempted to return. Pharaoh's expression didn't change. And that despite all of that, you came back in. There was a patient who needed help. Yes. Pharaoh looked at her for a moment. Why didn't you just call HR when they opened at 8? The question surprised her, and she thought about it honestly before answering. Because the patient was already in the building. If I'd been wrong about the presentation, if it had been a standard STEMI, they had capable staff and the right protocols. But if I was right, waiting 2 hours was not a risk I was willing to take. Pharaoh's expression shifted by a degree. Not warmly, just with the precise acknowledgement of someone who had heard a correct answer and registered it. Hale said, "Tell her the rest." Pharaoh looked at him briefly, then back at Emily. We've been pulling the security records for Kellport General going back 3 years. Commander Solis requested access at 07:30, and the hospital's legal counsel complied within the hour, given the circumstances. She paused. Grant Mercer has been Deputy Chief of Security here for 6 years. In that time, 15 formal complaints were filed against him by nursing staff and incoming employees. 12 of those complaints were closed without investigation. The other 3 were classified as resolved, with no documentation of how. She looked down at the tablet she'd taken from Solis. The pattern is consistent. He targeted new hires, specifically women, specifically those coming from non-traditional backgrounds or with credentials he found reason to question. In 3 separate cases, badge activation for incoming staff was deliberately delayed in the system the night before their start date. Emily went still. He had access to the badging system, she said. He had administrative access to the badging system, Pharaoh confirmed. He used it. The room was quiet for a moment. Ortega, at the monitor, had stopped pretending to look at the display. He manufactured the problem he used to remove me, Emily said. That's the current assessment, yes. Pharaoh set the tablet down. The badge activation delay on your file was entered at 11:47 last night. He would have seen your name on tomorrow's intake list and run the same play he's run on at least 4 other incoming staff members. Except this morning, you walked back in. She looked at Emily steadily. And you were right about the Admiral. The weight of it settled. Not dramatically. There was no drama left in it, only the grim arithmetic of understanding exactly what had been done and by whom and for how long. 15 complaints, Emily said quietly. 15 documented. The actual number is likely higher. Pharaoh folded her hands. The hospital's legal team is already preparing a statement. Mercer has been suspended pending a full investigation. His access to every system in this building was revoked at 9:42 this morning. Hale shifted in the bed. His face was drawn, the earlier composure thinner now, the toll of the morning showing through. The reason I asked you to come back up, he said, is that Admiral Pharaoh has a proposal. I wanted you to hear it directly from her. Emily looked at Pharaoh. The Defense Health Integration Office has been piloting a program for the past 18 months, Pharaoh said. We embed clinical advisors with hybrid backgrounds, military medicine and civilian practice, in Level 2 and Level 3 trauma centers in port cities. The purpose is knowledge transfer in both directions. What civilian emergency medicine has learned that field medicine hasn't systematized, and vice versa. Kellport General is on the expansion list. She met Emily's eyes. We've been looking for the right person to anchor the Kellport placement for 4 months. Emily didn't say anything. The role is a hybrid appointment. You would hold a standard nursing position at Kellport, which you already have, and an advisory designation through our office. No classified work. No operational commitment. Primarily clinical consultation, protocol review, and training. Pharaoh paused. It pays more than the nursing position alone. Substantially more. The corridor outside had gone quiet enough that Emily could hear the monitor above Hale's bed running its quiet cycle. She was aware of Solis in the corner, of Ortega at the window, of the man in the suit still outside the door. She was aware of the temporary credential clipped to her lanyard and the orientation she was still scheduled to attend at 2 o'clock. She was aware of every version of this morning that could have happened and hadn't. I need to understand something, Emily said. Pharaoh waited. The placement, the timeline. You said you've been looking for the right person for 4 months. Was this... She stopped, chose the words precisely. Was this morning on your radar before this morning? Farrow looked at her for 3 seconds without blinking. No, she said. Until Solis called Washington at 07:15, I had never heard your name. Emily looked at Hale. He said quietly, She's telling the truth. She held the silence for a moment. Then she said, I need to think about it. Farrow nodded. You have time. How much time? A week, maybe 2. Farrow stood, and the movement had the unhurried certainty of a woman who was accustomed to making offers that got accepted and was comfortable with the ones that didn't. But I'd like your answer before the investigation closes, because once the formal findings are published, the conversation about what happened here today gets much louder. And at that point, she looked at Emily with the frank directness that had characterized everything she'd said in this room. The program benefits from having you already in place. She crossed to the door. The man in the suit opened it from outside. She turned back once. The 15 nurses Mercer targeted, she said. Most of them left. 2 of them never worked in a hospital again. She said it without emotion. The way facts are delivered when the emotion attached to them has been held long enough to become something quieter. You came back through the door. She paused. That matters. She walked out. The door swung closed. Emily sat in the chair for a moment. Hale was watching her with tired, clear eyes. Ortega had turned fully from the monitor now, making no pretense of attending to anything else. You don't have to decide anything today, Hale said. I know. She looked at her hands. What happened to Mercer? Right now, I mean. Where is he? Solis answered from the corner. He's in the second-floor conference room with hospital legal and one of our JAG officers. He's been there since 9:50. Is he talking? Initially, no. Solis looked at her tablet. That changed about 20 minutes ago. Emily looked up. What changed? Solis turned the tablet toward her. On the screen was a still frame from what was clearly security footage. The lobby, the checkpoint, the timestamp reading 6:09 a.m. The angle was from the camera above the security booth, exactly the one she'd looked at in the lobby 40 minutes ago. The image was clear enough to read expression, clear enough to see the motion of a hand moving toward a lanyard, clear enough to see the precise moment a badge was lifted from a person who had done nothing wrong, clear enough to see in the left corner of the frame 3 of the night shift nurses who had been waiting for the elevator. Witnesses, recorded. Solis said, We found something else in the footage. She turned the tablet again. Different timestamp, different date, 3 months earlier. Different woman in the intake lane, young, scrubs, duffel bag over one shoulder, the posture of someone on their first day and trying not to show it. Same booth, same figure in gray, the same sequence, different victim. And then Solis swiped again. Another date, another woman. Another first day dismantled in a lobby while people stood and watched and said nothing. Emily looked at the screen for a long moment. How many? She said. Solis's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. That's what the JAG officer is currently asking him. Somewhere below them, on the second floor of Kellport General, in a conference room with a table and chairs and the flat institutional light of every room where accountability finally catches up to the people who thought it wouldn't, a door opened, and a JAG officer's voice, carrying through the partial gap before it closed again, said 2 words clearly enough that the nursing supervisor at the station nearest the stairwell heard them, and later would not be able to say what exactly made her stop what she was doing and stand very still. All of them. The nursing supervisor at the station nearest the stairwell was a woman named Renee Alcott, and she had worked at Kellport General for 11 years. She had seen administrators come and go, had watched 2 chief nursing officers resign under pressure, had once held compression on a trauma patient in an elevator when the ER ran out of bays. She was not a person who startled easily. She stood still for 4 seconds after those 2 words came through the stairwell door. Then she picked up her phone and called the charge nurse on 3, and when the charge nurse answered, Alcott said only, "Something's happening. You should know." That was how it started moving through the building. Not an announcement, not a memo, but the organic transmission of a place that had a nervous system, where information traveled in the gaps between official channels, nurse to nurse, corridor to corridor, the way it always did when something true was working its way to the surface. Emily didn't know any of that yet. She was still sitting in Hale's room, looking at the frozen image on Solis's tablet. The woman from 3 months ago, duffel bag over one shoulder, the same intake lane, the same figure in gray moving toward her with the practiced certainty of someone running a familiar play. She was trying to count backwards. 3 months? And then the clip before that had been 5 months ago, and the one before that 7. Not every month. Not even every quarter. But often enough, and patterned enough, that it was impossible to call it coincidence or call it anything other than what it was. "How long has he been in that position?" she asked. Solis said, "Deputy Chief, 6 years. Before that, he was a line officer here for 4 years, 10 years total. And the badging system access. He's had administrative credentials to the employee badging system for the last 4 years. It was granted when he was promoted to Deputy Chief as part of the standard authorization package for that role. It's the kind of access that gets assigned and then not reviewed." Solis paused. "Nobody reviewed it," Hale said from the bed. "Until today." "Until today," Solis confirmed. Emily looked at the still image on the tablet for another moment and then looked away, not because she couldn't stand to look at it, but because she'd absorbed what it contained and, looking longer, didn't change anything. She looked at the monitor above Hale's bed instead. His pressure was at 111/70 now, the rhythm strip clean and steady. He looked exhausted in the specific way of someone whose body had used up an enormous amount of something and had not yet been given time to resupply. "You should rest," she said. "I've been told that 4 times this morning," he said, "and I'm beginning to think people are saying it because they don't know what else to say to me. Or because it's true. It's possibly both." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" The question caught her slightly off guard, the way direct questions do when you've spent the past several hours entirely focused outward. She thought about giving him the same answer she'd given Doherty, working on it, but something about the directness of his expression made that feel insufficient. "I'm angry," she said. "Not at you, not at the hospital, just—" She looked at the tablet, which Solis had lowered to her side. 15 complaints. The actual number is probably higher, and it ran for 6 years inside a building that takes care of sick people. She stopped. "I'm angry about that." Hale looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said quietly. "Stay angry. Just don't let it be the only thing." She stood up. "I'll come back before orientation." "I'll be here," he said. "Apparently I don't have a choice about that." The second floor of Kellport General had 4 conference rooms off the main administrative corridor. Room 2A was where HR conducted benefits orientations. Room 2B had a broken projector screen that had been broken for 8 months and that nobody had filed a work order for. Room 2C was where Emily's orientation was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Room 2D was where Grant Mercer was sitting across a table from a JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Paul Ashby, a hospital legal counsel named Fiona Graves, and a representative from the state's Department of Health, who had arrived at 10:47 with a leather satchel and the expression of someone who did not consider this a routine visit. Emily knew none of the details of what was happening in 2D. She knew the room number from the placard on the door, and she knew there were voices inside it because she could hear them when she passed, low and indistinct through the walls, the particular cadence of an institutional reckoning. Questions asked in flat official tones, pauses, the sound of documents being placed on a table. She kept walking. She found a family waiting area at the end of the administrative corridor that had 2 chairs, a small table with outdated magazines, and a window facing the parking structure. She sat in one of the chairs and pulled out her phone and looked at it without calling anyone. She thought about the other women on that footage. She thought about the one from 3 months ago, the duffel bag, the scrubs, the posture of a first day. She didn't know what happened to her after the lobby, whether she'd fought it or filed something or just gone home and decided the job wasn't worth it, whether she was working somewhere else now or had given up on hospital nursing entirely, or was in a different city at a different hospital where nobody in a gray uniform had decided her credentials looked suspicious. She thought about the phrase most of them left, which was what Pharaoh had said. Not some. Most. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she'd saved as YOST-HR during the call that morning. "Hi, Ms. Cross. Just confirming orientation is still on for 2 p.m. in 2C. Please let me know if anything has changed on your end. She looked at the text for a moment. Then she typed back, "Still on. See you at 2." She put the phone down and looked out the window at the parking structure. Her car was in there somewhere, 3rd level, the worn duffel on the passenger seat, the orientation envelope in the front pocket. 8 years of training folded into a manila envelope with a state seal on the license inside it. She thought about the drive here this morning and the specific quality of the nervousness she'd felt sitting in the car before she got out. Not fear exactly, but the calibrated tension of beginning something, of standing at the threshold of a version of herself she hadn't tried yet. The version that worked inside walls, that had a time card and a locker and a supervisor and a floor to report to and a badge on a lanyard. The badge was still wherever Mercer had put it. That thought surfaced without warning, and she pushed it down because it was a small thing, administratively, and it would be resolved today, and it was not the point. But it surfaced again anyway, stubbornly, because it wasn't about the badge. It was about the gesture. The lifting of it from her lanyard with the casual, deliberate precision of someone who had done it before and expected no consequences. She had looked at him, and he had let go of her arm, and later she had understood what that moment was. Not a concession, not hesitation, but the recalibration of a man who had read her expression and decided she was going to be a problem. That she was going to be harder to remove than the others. That she had the particular quality of someone who does not stay removed. He had been right about that, at least. At 11:30, Solis found her in the waiting area and sat down in the other chair. "He's talking," Solis said. Emily looked at her. "Full cooperation, as of 40 minutes ago. The JAG officer has a recording running, and the hospital legal counsel is documenting separately." Solis had her tablet, but wasn't looking at it, which meant she was here to deliver information, not to read it. He accessed the badging system on at least 9 occasions over 3 years to delay activation for incoming staff. Not all of them were first-day targets. 2 of them were lateral transfers from other departments who had filed internal complaints against people in his security division. Solis paused. He delayed their access as a way of creating grounds to remove them from the building before they could escalate their complaints. He suppressed internal complaints, Emily said. He managed them. That's the word he's using. He says he was protecting the department's reputation. Solis's expression conveyed exactly what she thought of that framing without her saying it. The 12 complaints that were closed without investigation, 6 of them were formally signed off by a supervisor who left the hospital 2 years ago. The other 6 have Mercer's own digital signature in the system, which means he had access to the HR intake records as well. Someone gave him that access and either didn't know what he was using it for or chose not to look. The supervisor who left, did they leave voluntarily? Solis met her eyes. That's one of the things the Department of Health representative is currently asking the CEO. Emily looked out the window. The parking structure was the same gray it had been, the light unchanged, the ordinary mid-morning world continuing outside this building, while inside it, in a conference room with a broken projector screen next door, the accumulated damage of 6 years was being read into a record that nobody could close without investigation anymore. The women on the footage, Emily said, the ones before me. Is anyone reaching out to them? The JAG officer is compiling a list. That's next. Solis paused. It won't be fast. Some of them may not want to be contacted. Some of them may have moved. She looked at Emily directly. But yes, it's happening. Emily nodded. She looked at her hands in her lap, the steady, ordinary hands of someone who had spent 8 years in situations that required them to be reliable. And she thought about reliability, about what it meant to be a person that other people could count on, in the specific and unglamorous way of someone whose job was not to be brilliant, but to be consistent, to show up and make the right call and absorb the consequences when the right call cost something. She had showed up this morning. The rest of it had come from that. What? At 12:15, Caldwell appeared in the waiting area. He was alone, and he looked like a man who had spent the past several hours in a series of conversations he had not been prepared for and was carrying the combined weight of all of them in the set of his shoulders. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Emily, and for a moment his expression ran through several versions of itself before settling on something that was probably the closest he could get to direct. "Ms. Cross," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" Yes. He came in and stood near the window because there were only two chairs, and Solus was in one of them, and he didn't ask Solus to move, which told Emily something about how the power dynamics in this building had shifted in the past 6 hours. He looked at Emily and he said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "This morning in the trauma bay, I was responding to what Mercer had told me about you, and I should have looked at the documentation myself before I came in there. The letter from HR, your nursing license, those were verifiable in under 2 minutes. I didn't verify them." He stopped. "And you were in the middle of helping a patient stay alive while I was questioning your right to be in the room." He said it plainly, without excessive decoration, which was the only version of an apology that Emily found credible. She looked at him. "Did you know about the complaints?" she said. "The 15 that were filed." He held her gaze. "I knew there had been complaints. I did not know the number, and I did not know what had happened to them after filing." He paused. "I should have known." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He didn't flinch from that. "What can I do?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. She could tell from the way he said it, the flatness of it, the absence of the particular upward inflection that turns a question into a performance, that he meant it as an operational inquiry. "The women on that footage," she said, "the ones before me. When the investigation is complete and the findings are documented, I want to know that the hospital is going to reach out to every single one of them, not just legally, not just to establish liability, actually reach out." She looked at him steadily. "Acknowledge what happened." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll make that commitment personally." "I'd like it in writing." He looked at her for a beat, and then something in his face settled, the way faces settle when a person decides to stop managing a situation and just inhabit it. "You'll have it by end of day," he said. After he left, Solus said, "That was well done." Emily said, "It shouldn't have been necessary." "No," Solus agreed. "It shouldn't have." The orientation at 2 o'clock had 7 new hires in it, 4 nurses, 2 medical assistants, and a pharmacy technician. And none of them knew anything about what had happened that morning, except that there was a different officer at the security checkpoint than usual, and the lobby had a slightly charged quality that could have been anything. Emily sat in the second row of room 2C and filled out her paperwork, and listened to Diane Yost walk through the benefits package with the practiced ease of someone who had given the same presentation many times, and had learned to make it feel slightly less scripted than it was. Her replacement badge, a fresh one, newly printed, her photo crisp on it, was waiting in an envelope at the front of the room with her name on it. She picked it up when Yost called her name. She put it on the lanyard. She sat back down. The pharmacy technician sitting beside her was a young man of about 23 named Torres, who had transferred from a hospital in Bangor and was clearly trying to decide whether to ask her something. She could tell from the way he kept looking sideways at her and then looking at his paperwork and then looking sideways again. Finally, he said in a low voice, "You're the one from this morning, right? The lobby thing?" She looked at him. "News travels. The night shift nurses told the day shift nurses," he said. "The day shift nurses told basically everyone." He paused. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "That's what people say when—" "I know what people say it for. I'm actually fine." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded and went back to his paperwork. And she went back to hers, and the orientation continued in the ordinary institutional way of orientations everywhere. The insurance forms, the parking validation, the 3-minute video about hand hygiene protocols that everyone watched with the polite attention of people who were thinking about something else. It was fine. It was ordinary. It was exactly what she had come here for. She was still in orientation when the thing she hadn't anticipated happened. At 2:48, Solus appeared in the doorway of room 2C. She caught Emily's eye and made the small controlled gesture of someone saying, "I need you," without making a scene. Emily excused herself quietly and stepped into the corridor and pulled the door most of the way closed. "What happened?" Emily said. Solus said, "Mercer's attorney arrived at 2:15. Standard procedure. Once he started talking on record, his attorney was notified." She paused, and in the pause was the quality of someone choosing how to deliver information that carries weight. "The attorney asked for a recess. Mercer used the recess to make a phone call. To who? We're still working on that. But the call lasted 4 minutes, and at the end of it, Mercer's posture in the room changed significantly. Solis looked at her. He retracted his cooperation, completely. Everything he said in the past 2 hours he's now claiming was made under duress. Emily looked at her steadily. He can't actually claim duress from a voluntary statement. His attorney can create enough procedural noise to slow the process significantly, which is the point. Solis held her gaze. The concern is that whoever he called has influence inside this hospital's administrative structure, which would explain how his HR access was never reviewed and why 12 complaints were closed without documentation. She paused. The Department of Health representative is still in the building, so is the JAG officer. But if there is institutional protection above Mercer, the investigation becomes substantially more complicated. Emily thought about the supervisor who had left 2 years ago, about 6 complaints with Mercer's own digital signature and 6 more with a signature that was gone, about a position with administrative access to both the badging system and the HR complaint intake, held for 4 years without a review. That kind of access doesn't get assigned without someone approving it, she said. No, Solis said. It doesn't. Who approved it? Solis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the approval signature on Mercer's badging system authorization 4 years ago belongs to the then Director of Hospital Operations. She paused. Who is now the Chief Operating Officer of Kellport General? Emily felt the shape of it take form. Not Mercer at the top. Mercer at the middle. A man in a gray uniform who was effective and useful, and who, for 4 years, had been doing in a lobby what someone with more to protect couldn't afford to do themselves. Clearing out the people who asked inconvenient questions, filed complaints that might travel upward, came in from backgrounds that didn't bend easily. His name, Emily said. Solis said, Marcus Pruitt. He was in the administrative corridor this morning. He's the one who was in the building when you were removed. She looked at Emily directly. He's the one Mercer called during the recess. The corridor outside room 2C was quiet. From inside, Emily could hear Yost's voice continuing the orientation. Something about the employee assistance program, the phrasing measured and reassuring and utterly disconnected from what was happening 6 feet away. Does Hale know? Emily said. I'm going to him next. Solis held her gaze. But there's something else, something that changes the timeline. She reached into her jacket and produced a folded paper, a printout. She could tell from the quality of it, something that had been pulled and printed in haste. When we pulled the approval records for Mercer's systems access, we found something attached to the same authorization thread, an email chain, 4 years old. She held the paper toward Emily. Pruitt wasn't just approving access. He was directing Mercer specifically. There are 11 emails over a 2-month period in which Pruitt identifies incoming staff by name and Mercer responds with the actions he plans to take. She paused. One of those names is a nurse named Amara Osei. She filed a complaint about a physician in the surgical department 8 months before Mercer removed her on her 2nd week. The physician she filed the complaint against is still practicing here. Emily took the paper. She looked at the top of the chain. 4 years ago, the date precise, the institutional email addresses unmistakable. She read 2 lines of the first email and looked up. Pruitt's still in the building, she said. He's in a meeting with the CEO on the 5th floor. Emily looked at the paper in her hand. She looked at the door of room 2C, through which she could hear the ordinary sounds of an ordinary orientation proceeding in its ordinary way. She thought about everything she had carried into this building this morning. The duffel, the documentation, the 8 years of knowledge compressed into a nursing license and a portable medication kit she'd kept for sentimental reasons. She had come here to start something. She had not known yet what she was walking into. She handed the paper back to Solis. We need Pharaoh, she said. Solis said, she's already on the phone with the Department of Health representative. They've been on a call for the past 20 minutes. She looked at Emily with the particular quality of someone delivering the last piece of information in a sequence. She asked me to find you before she comes back up. Why? Solis looked at her steadily. Because the Department of Health representative brought someone with her that we didn't know about this morning, she said. Someone who was waiting in a car in the parking structure until the situation developed enough to come in. She paused. He's a federal investigator, healthcare fraud and corruption, Department of Justice, and he's been building a case on Kellport General's administrative structure for 14 months. Emily went very still. He already knew about Pruitt, Solis said. He didn't know about Mercer. He didn't know about the badging system, the complaint suppression, or the names in those emails. She held Emily's eyes. He asked specifically to speak with you. Tonight, if possible. Because everything that happened in this building today accelerated his timeline by... She paused. His words were significantly. 14 months. A federal investigation running in the background of this building for 14 months, while Mercer ran his plays in the lobby and Pruitt signed authorizations and 12 complaints vanished into a filing system that nobody reviewed. And this morning, on what was supposed to be her first quiet day in a hospital that had walls and electricity and a bed count she hadn't memorized yet, Emily Cross had walked back through a door. She looked at Solis. "What time?" she said. "He said whenever you're ready." Solis held her gaze. "But Ms. Cross, before you go in there, you should know that what he's asking you to speak to is not just what happened this morning. He wants to document your full account of every interaction, every observation, every detail of how this building presented itself to you from the moment you arrived." She paused. "He said, and I'm quoting, that a person walking into a compromised institution for the first time sees things that the people inside it have stopped seeing." Emily thought about the lobby at 5:47 a.m. She thought about 2 fingers on a keyboard, a deliberate pace, a system that had an answer that was wrong by design. She thought about every small thing she had clocked and cataloged in the way she had been trained to: exits and obstructions, power structures and pressure points, the specific way a room's atmosphere changes when someone in it is performing authority they don't actually have. She had seen all of it. She hadn't known yet what it meant. Now she did. From the end of the corridor, the elevator opened. A man she didn't know stepped out. Civilian clothes, mid-40s, a badge on his jacket that she couldn't read at this distance. He was followed by Farrow, who had her phone in her hand and was already looking toward Emily, and behind Farrow was Caldwell, who had the expression of a man who had just been told something in an elevator that had changed the nature of the meeting he'd thought he was walking into. The man with the badge looked at Emily. He crossed the distance between them without hurry, and he extended a hand, and when she shook it, he said, "Ms. Cross, I'm Special Agent Richard Doan. I've been looking forward to this conversation." He glanced briefly at Caldwell, who had stopped 3 steps behind him. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm going to need this corridor cleared in about 4 minutes." Caldwell said, "Of course." Doan looked back at Emily. "I have some questions for you," and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a sealed envelope, standard letter size, with a return address she recognized immediately. The federal seal. "I have something I need to show you." He held the envelope toward her. She looked at it. She didn't take it yet. "What's in it?" she said. Doan looked at her with the level expression of a man who had been in enough rooms where things got complicated to appreciate someone who asked the direct question. "Everything," he said. "About this hospital, about the people who ran it, about what's been happening here." He paused. "And one thing about you specifically that I think you need to know before this goes any further." She took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. Not physically, but in the way that objects become heavy when you understand what they carry. She held it in both hands and looked at the federal seal, and then looked at Doan, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who had delivered difficult information to enough people to know that the moment before a person opens something irreversible has its own particular texture. "Should I open it now?" she said. "That's up to you," he said. "But yes, now is the right time." She broke the seal with her thumb and pulled out the contents. 3 pages, stapled at the corner, dense with the particular language of federal documentation. She read the first paragraph and stopped. She read it again. The corridor was quiet. Farrow was standing 6 feet away and not looking at her, which meant Farrow already knew what was in the document and was giving Emily the space to receive it without an audience reading her face. Solis was the same. Caldwell was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who had learned something in the past hour that had rearranged his understanding of the institution he ran. She read the full first page. The document was a summary memo from the Department of Justice's Healthcare Integrity Division, dated 11 days ago, summarizing the status of an ongoing investigation into Kellport General's administrative structure. The investigation had begun 14 months earlier after an anonymous tip to the federal hotline. It had expanded through subpoenaed financial records, internal communications, and the testimony of 2 former employees who had left the hospital in the past 2 years. One of those former employees was the supervisor who had left 2 years ago, the one whose name appeared on 6 of the 12 closed complaints. His name was Bernard Trask, and he had not left voluntarily. He had been pushed out by Pruitt after he began asking questions about the complaint closure process, and he had taken his documentation with him, and 14 months ago he had called a federal number and said he wanted to talk. The second page was a summary of what the investigation had found. It ran to 11 bullet points. She noticed them and registered that they were there in the document, not in her telling of it. And she read each one in sequence, and by the 4th one, her jaw had tightened, and by the 8th, she had stopped counting. The 9th point was the one Doan had meant when he said one thing about you specifically. She read it twice. Her name appeared in a communication between Pruitt and Mercer dated 6 weeks ago, 6 weeks before she started. Her hire date had been set, her file processed, her credentials submitted, and Pruitt had sent Mercer a message flagging her background, not her nursing credentials, her military record. The notation in the message was brief: prior service, classified unit, non-traditional background, handle at intake. He had known she was coming. He had told Mercer to remove her before she got through the door. She stood in the corridor with the 3 pages in her hands, and she breathed slowly, through her nose, the way she'd been taught to breathe in situations that required the body to remain functional while the mind processed something it hadn't anticipated. They had targeted her specifically, not randomly, not because Mercer had looked at her face in the lobby and made a snap judgment. He had known her name before she arrived. Pruitt had flagged her. The badge delay had been planned. She looked up at Doan. "This was premeditated," she said. "Yes," he said. "Against you specifically, and against at least 6 others we've identified whose removal was coordinated in advance." He looked at her without apology, because there was no version of this that an apology could address. "I want you to understand that this document exists because Bernard Trask walked out of this hospital 2 years ago with copies of communications he was never supposed to have. He spent 14 months being interviewed and corroborating documents and waiting for this investigation to reach the point where it could move." He paused. He knew it would happen. He just didn't know when. "He doesn't know about today," Emily said. "He does now. I called him this morning." Doan looked at her steadily. "He asked me to tell you," and this is his exact phrasing, I wrote it down, "that he was sorry it took this long." She looked at the document in her hands. She thought about a man she'd never met sitting in a different city, calling a federal number 14 months ago because he'd watched something wrong, run unchallenged for too long, and had decided that the act of leaving did not have to mean the act of surrender. She thought about the women on the footage. She thought about 15 complaints. She folded the document carefully and put it back in the envelope. "What happens now?" she said. Doan said, "Today, formally, Marcus Pruitt will be placed on administrative leave pending federal review. That is happening in," he checked his watch, "approximately 25 minutes when the notification is delivered to the CEO by the Department of Health representative. Mercer's suspension is already in place. Their system's access has been revoked." He paused. "The federal case continues. The investigation doesn't close with today's findings. Today accelerated it significantly, but the formal proceedings take time." He looked at her directly. "Your testimony, if you choose to provide it, will be part of the evidentiary record. It's not required. It is your choice." "It's not a difficult choice," she said. Something in his expression acknowledged that. "I thought you'd say that." Dumb. The notification to the CEO was delivered at 3:18 in the afternoon. Emily was not in the room when it happened. She was back on the 4th floor, sitting in the family waiting area at the end of the corridor, doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of necessary. The deliberate stillness of a person who has been moving through crisis since before 6 in the morning and needs 15 minutes of doing nothing before the next thing begins. She heard about it later from Solis, who delivered information the way she did everything, precisely, without excess. The CEO's name was Howard Bellman, and he had run Kellport General for 9 years and had been, by the investigation's preliminary assessment, willfully uninformed about what Pruitt was doing. Not complicit, not protected, but the specific variety of institutional leader who creates conditions for corruption by never looking at the things he doesn't want to see. When the Department of Health representative put the summary findings on the table in front of him, Bellman had gone very pale and asked for 15 minutes alone. And when the 15 minutes were up, he had made 3 phone calls: to the hospital's board chair, to the hospital's outside legal counsel, and according to Caldwell, who had been in the outer office, to his own personal attorney. Marcus Pruitt was escorted from the building by 2 of the Navy officers at 3:41. His keycard had already been deactivated. His parking permit was canceled by the time he reached the structure. He walked out through the main lobby in front of the afternoon shift change. Nurses coming on, families arriving, the regular population of a hospital in motion, and nobody stopped to watch because nobody had been told to watch. But 2 nurses at the information desk saw him go, and one of them, later, said that what she remembered most was that he was carrying his coffee mug, like he'd grabbed it off his desk without thinking, out of the muscle memory of a man whose routines had just ended. He didn't look at anyone on his way out. Hale was awake when Emily came back to his room at 4 o'clock. The cardiologist had been by twice more, and the afternoon had brought a calmer quality to his monitoring. Numbers settling into ranges that suggested the body was making its accommodation with what had happened to it, the grudging biological negotiation that follows a crisis that didn't become a catastrophe. He still looked like a man who had been through something. He was going to look like that for several days. "Tell me what happened," he said when she sat down. She told him. Not everything. The federal document wasn't hers to summarize fully, and Doan had been specific about what was on the record and what was still under active investigation. But she told him about the email, about her name in a communication 6 weeks ago, about handle at intake. He was quiet for a long time after that. "You knew something was wrong in the lobby," he said finally. "Not just that he was behaving badly. You knew it was deliberate." "I suspected it," she said. "I didn't know the shape of it yet." "But you came back in anyway." "There was a patient," she said. "That's still the reason." He looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that some people mean things literally and that it is a specific and uncommon quality and worth recognizing when you encounter it. "Yes," he said. "I know that's still the reason." He paused. "What are you going to do about Pharaoh's offer?" She had been thinking about it since the corridor. She had been thinking about it in the background, through the orientation and Doan's envelope, and the 15 minutes of deliberate stillness in the waiting area, turning it over without forcing an answer. "I'm going to take it," she said. He waited for her to say more. She looked at him. "Not because of today," she said. "Today changed the timeline. It didn't change the reason." She looked at the window. The afternoon light had finally broken through the coastal gray, not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself, just the ordinary shift from overcast to something slightly clearer. The thing that I know how to do, the thing from 8 years of working in places where the resources were wrong and the timeline was wrong and the information was incomplete, that thing has a use here, in rooms like this one. And I spent 2 years in nursing school thinking I was going to have to set it aside, learn a different way, become a different kind of clinician. She looked back at him. "I don't have to set it aside. I just have to find where it fits." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You know what I remember most from that night in Kiosk?" "What?" "You didn't say anything reassuring," he said. "You didn't tell me I was going to be fine. You didn't tell me anything." He paused. "You just worked. I was watching you from the ground, and I was in and out, and I could barely track what was happening, but I could tell from the way you moved that you knew what you were doing, that you'd made a decision, and you were executing it, and the outcome was going to be what it was going to be." He held her gaze. "That's a rarer thing than people think. Most people, under that kind of pressure, narrate. They fill the silence with something because the silence is frightening." He paused. "You don't." She didn't say anything. That's not a compliment, he said, almost dryly. It's an observation. It's the same thing I watched you do in this hospital today. You don't fill the silence, you use it. She thought about that. About the lobby this morning, standing in front of Mercer, absorbing what he was doing with the specific economy of someone who understood that the energy spent on reacting in the moment is energy not available for what comes after. She had been angry. She was still angry, but the anger had never been louder than the calculation. It's not always a virtue, she said. No, he agreed. Sometimes people need to hear the thing. He looked at her steadily. But you know that too. You're not missing the emotional register. You're just choosing when to use it. He shifted against the pillow, the careful adjustment of a man learning the temporary geography of a hospital bed. My point is, and I do have one, Pharaoh's program needs people who know how to operate in the space between what the protocol says and what the situation actually requires. That's not a skill you teach. That's a skill you test. He looked at her. You've been tested. She almost said continuously, but didn't, because it would have been true and also would have shifted the conversation into something more personal than she wanted it to be. Instead, she said, I'll call Pharaoh tonight. Good. He settled back. Now I'm going to sleep because apparently that's what I'm supposed to do, and I've been informed that ignoring medical advice is not a winning strategy in a cardiac unit. He looked at her with the dry directness that she was beginning to understand was his default register for warmth. Thank you, Cross. For today and for Coast. Get some rest, Admiral, she said. She stood, and she was at the door when he said, Cross. She turned. The women on the footage, the ones before you. He looked at her from the bed with the tired, clear eyes of a man saying something he meant precisely. Make sure they know what happened here today. She held his gaze for a moment. I will, she said. The next 3 weeks moved the way institutional consequences move. Not quickly, not cleanly, with reversals and frustrations and the bureaucratic friction that justice produces when it tries to move through systems that were designed by the people it's trying to hold accountable. Mercer's cooperation, retracted on day 1, was retracted again by day 4 when his attorney sat down with the scope of the federal documentation and advised him, with the flat professional candor of someone who had run the numbers, that cooperation was significantly preferable to the alternative. He provided a full written account, signed and notarized, on day 8. It ran to 22 pages and named Pruitt in 37 specific instances. Pruitt's attorney attempted to have the email communications suppressed on procedural grounds. The motion was denied on day 12. Pruitt entered into preliminary discussions with federal prosecutors on day 17, which meant the word deal was somewhere in the conversation, which meant the case was moving toward resolution at the speed of 2 men who had looked at the evidence and made the calculation that fighting it was not in their interest. Bellman, the CEO, was not charged. But the board conducted an independent review of his leadership, and on day 19 he announced his intention to retire, effective in 60 days, for personal health reasons. Nobody at Kellport General said publicly that they believed that explanation. Nobody said publicly that they didn't. The institution moved forward in the way that institutions do, carrying its history imperfectly, resolving to do better in the specific way of organizations that have been frightened into reform and are genuinely uncertain whether the fright will last. Bernard Trask found out about all of it through Doan and through a letter from Fiona Graves, the hospital's legal counsel, that acknowledged his termination had been retaliatory and offered a formal settlement. He called Emily on day 11. She had expected him to sound relieved. He sounded tired, which she understood better. I just want to know the nurses are going to be okay, he said. Some of them already are, she said. We're still finding some of the others. How many? 19 so far. We think there are more. He was quiet for a moment. 19. Yes. Another pause, then he said, You know the worst part? I knew something was wrong for years. I filed things and watched them disappear, and I told myself I was working from inside, that leaving would make it worse. He stopped. I stayed 3 years too long. You left, she said. You took the documents. You made the call. Eventually still counts, she said. Eventually is what we've got most of the time. He didn't say anything to that, but she heard him breathe, the long exhale of a person setting down something they've been carrying. Partempt. On the morning of day 23, Kellport General held a staff assembly in the hospital's main conference center, a room on the ground floor that held 300 people with the chairs arranged theater style and the usual acoustic problems of a space designed for function rather than speech. Attendance was not mandatory. By 8:45, there were 260 people in the chairs, with another 30 standing along the walls. Emily sat in the fourth row. She had not been told exactly what the assembly was for. The invitation had said staff update and recognition event in the language of hospital communications that tells you very little. She had come because Doherty, the nursing supervisor from 4, had texted her the night before. "You should be there tomorrow, front rows." Caldwell opened the assembly. He had aged visibly in 3 weeks in the way that some people age, when the thing they'd been successfully not looking at comes into full view. Not dramatically, but the lines around his mouth were deeper and his posture carried something it hadn't before, the particular weight of a man learning to lead differently than he had been. He spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't use notes. He named what had happened, not euphemistically, not in the language of a recent situation or an administrative matter, but directly. He named Mercer. He named Pruitt. He named the complaint suppression and the badging system manipulation and the number 19, which was the confirmed count of staff members who had been targeted. He said the hospital was cooperating fully with the federal investigation and with the state review. He said that outreach to all 19 individuals had been initiated and that the hospital had committed to individual settlements with each of them. He said that all of that was the minimum that was owed and that he was not standing in front of them to take credit for the minimum. Then he said Emily's name. She had not been told he was going to do this. He said it in the context of what had happened on that first morning, not dramatically, not with the hagiographic excess that public recognition sometimes tips into, but with the specific and unembellished account of a woman who arrived with correct documentation, was prevented from entering by a system that had been deliberately compromised, and came back through the door anyway, who stood in a trauma bay and told a room full of trained clinicians something they had missed, who, in the course of a single morning, had provided the thread that an entire federal investigation needed to begin its unraveling. When he said her name the first time, several people turned to look at her, and she looked back at them with the neutral composure of someone who was not entirely comfortable being looked at and was managing it. When he finished speaking, Admiral Hale stood up. He was in civilian clothes. He had been discharged from Kellport General 4 days earlier under Ortega's very specific instructions about activity restrictions that he was, by his own admission, already testing. And he walked to the front of the room with the careful gait of a man still recalibrating. He didn't use the microphone. He didn't need to. He said, "I owe this hospital a debt I intend to pay in the form of whatever institutional support this facility needs from Naval Health Command in the next 18 months. I want that on the record." He looked around the room. "And I owe Emily Cross a debt I can't pay, because you can't pay someone for saving your life. Twice." He found her in the fourth row and held her gaze. "What I can do is say, in front of everyone in this room, that she is the most capable medical professional I have encountered in 34 years of service, and that the institution that made her feel like she didn't belong should be embarrassed by that for a very long time." The room was quiet for a beat. Then it wasn't. The applause started somewhere in the middle rows and moved outward, and it was not the polite applause of a managed event, but something more uneven and genuine, the kind that builds because the people doing it are not performing for each other, but responding to something real. Doherty, in the second row, was clapping with the contained expression of a man who does not often display emotion, and was deciding it was acceptable this once. Patty, the night shift nurse who had pressed a cup of coffee into Emily's hands on that first morning, was clapping and also crying, which she was clearly annoyed about. Doctor. Vane was standing, which meant others stood, and then most of the room was standing, and Emily sat in the fourth row for 3 seconds longer than she should have. And then she stood too, because it would have been stranger not to, and she looked at the room of people who were on their feet, and she felt the complicated mixture of things that comes when something you endured for a long time is finally, publicly, named for what it was. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, though that was in it somewhere. More like the quiet release of a person who had been carrying the weight of being right in a room that told them they were wrong, and who could now set that particular weight down and pick up something different. She thought about cost, about the 22-year-old in Kandahar, about the notebook in the storage unit in Virginia that she had not yet retrieved and was now thinking she might go get. She thought about 19 names. She thought about Amara Osei, whose name had been in an email 4 years ago, who had filed a complaint against a physician and been removed for it. Osei was the third name they had reached in the outreach process. She was working as a home health aide in a city 2 states away, which was not what she had trained for and not what she had wanted, and when Fiona Graves had called her, she had been silent for a long time before saying anything. Emily had not been on that call. She had been told about it afterward. She had been told that what Osei finally said, after the long silence, was, "I thought I was the only one." She had not been the only one. None of them had been the only one. That was the thing about institutional cruelty. It operated most effectively in isolation, each person convinced their experience was singular and therefore unverifiable, each person calculating that the cost of fighting outweighed the cost of leaving. Mercer had understood that. Pruitt had understood that. The silence around those 12 closed complaints had been a constructed silence, maintained by the specific mechanism of making each person feel that they were alone in what had happened to them. The 19th name had broken that silence. The first name had been Bernard Trask, walking out of a building 2 years ago with copies of things he wasn't supposed to have, making a call 14 months ago into a federal number, waiting. The 20th name, and Emily understood now that she was the 20th name, the one that arrived on the morning when everything was finally close enough to the surface that the right person in the right lobby at the right time could pull it through, had simply been the last thread. She had not planned to be that. She had planned to be a nurse, to show up 13 minutes early and fill out her paperwork and learn the floor and do the work. She was still going to do all of that. 3 days later, she signed the advisory designation paperwork with Farrow's office. The role was formal as of the first of the following month. Hybrid appointment, Kellport General, and Naval Health Integration. The exact thing Farrow had described in Hale's hospital room on the morning it had all come apart and begun, simultaneously, to come together. Solis was there when she signed it, as a witness, and afterward they stood in the parking structure beside Emily's car, and the afternoon was cold and the salt smell of the harbor was on the wind, and Solis said, "How does it feel?" Emily thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer that question. "It feels like starting," she said, "which is what it is." Solis nodded. She looked out at the harbor, visible through the open side of the structure, the gray water and the working boats and the ordinary industrial life of a port city going about its business. "I want to say something," she said, off record, not official. "Okay. What you did on that first morning, coming back through the door, I want you to know that most people don't do that." She looked at Emily. "I've been in a lot of situations where the easier thing and the right thing were different things, and I've watched a lot of people choose the easier thing and not blame them for it because it's human and the costs are real." She paused. "You didn't calculate it. You just went back in." "I calculated it," Emily said. "I stood on the sidewalk for about 90 seconds. I went through the options. And there was a patient." She looked at the harbor. "That's the whole calculation. There was a patient, and I had information that might matter, and the rest of it was noise." Solis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The JAG officer told me something about the Coast record. I'm not supposed to know it, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I want you to know that what you did there, the 40 minutes with the improvised seal, the 4 units of ONEG from your personal kit, that's in a case study now. Has been for 2 years. It's part of the training curriculum for forward medics in 2 different operational theaters." She looked at Emily. "You save people who don't know your name." Emily stood with that for a moment. She thought about the notebook in Virginia. She thought about writing things down in a tent by flashlight after Kandahar because she needed to understand what had gone wrong and what had almost gone wrong and what she would do differently and what she would do the same. She had written it for herself and only for herself, the way most useful things are written, without audience and without the expectation that anyone else would find it worth reading. Someone had found it worth training on. She didn't have a response to that. There was no response that didn't either minimize it or overclaim it, so she just said, "Thank you for telling me." Solis nodded once. She was not a person who extended conversations past their natural end. She turned toward her vehicle, and then she stopped and looked back. "One more thing," she said. "Amara Osei, the nurse who filed the complaint 4 years ago." "What about her?" "She called the hospital yesterday, not the legal team. She called the nursing department directly." Solis looked at her. She asked if there were any open positions. Emily held that for a moment. "Is there?" she said. "There is now," Solis said, and she got in her car. Mom. Emily stood in the parking structure for a moment after Solis drove away. The harbor wind came through again, colder this time, and she pulled her jacket tighter and looked out at the water. She thought about the worn duffel on her passenger seat and the notebook she was going to retrieve from a storage unit in Virginia on her next day off. She thought about 19 people and the long process of rebuilding that doesn't happen on a timeline anyone controls. She thought about an empty nursing position and a woman 2 states away who had been told for 4 years that the job wasn't hers anymore. She thought about the lobby at 5:47 in the morning and a man in a gray uniform with 2 fingers on a keyboard and the 90 seconds she had spent on a sidewalk deciding whether to go back through the door. She was glad she had gone back, not because of the recognition or the federal case or the signed paperwork in her jacket pocket. Those were outcomes. They mattered, but they were not the reason. She had gone back because there was a patient, because she had information that might matter, because standing on the sidewalk and waiting for 8 o'clock felt, in her body, like a decision she could not make and remain the person she had spent 8 years becoming. That was the whole of it. That was all the wisdom she had, and she was not certain it was wisdom so much as stubbornness in a coat that fit better. She had been trained to go toward the thing that needed doing and to not stop going toward it because someone in a gray uniform told her she didn't belong. She had learned, in Kandahar and Djibouti and a mountain town whose name she still couldn't say in public, that belonging is not granted by the people at the door. It is claimed by the people who do the work. She had done the work. And in the doing, she had found 19 people who had done their work too and been turned away. And she had found one man who had walked out with documents he wasn't supposed to have and carried them for 14 months. And she had found a cardiologist who wanted to write up a field case so that the next clinician in the next trauma bay would have a better chance of catching it. And she had found a nursing supervisor who handed her a cup of coffee without explanation and a young pharmacy technician who asked if she was okay and actually meant it. She had not found a perfect institution. She had found a broken one that was trying, haltingly, and with the particular gracelessness of institutions under pressure, to do better. That was the available version. That was what there was to work with. She was going to work with it. She got in her car. She started the engine. She looked at the duffel on the passenger seat, the worn canvas, the duct-taped bottom panel, the zipper she had replaced once, and she thought about all the distance it had covered and all the distance that remained, and she put the car in drive. The harbor was gray and cold and ordinary, and the city was waking up around it in the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. And Emily Cross drove out of the parking structure of Kellport General Hospital and into the morning, carrying everything she had, moving toward what came next. Some people build their authority on power. Some people build it on service. The difference announces itself not in the lobby and not at the checkpoint, and not in the moment when someone in a gray uniform decides whether you belong. It announces itself in the accumulated weight of every decision you make when no one is watching, when the easier choice is right there and the right choice costs something and you make it anyway, not because someone will see you do it, but because you are trying, imperfectly and without guarantee, to become a person that a sick human being in a frightening room can count on. That is the only authority that lasts. Everything else is just noise at the door.